Deep within the ash grove forest, where the canopy was so thick that the sun's rays could barely penetrate, there was a darkness that had always lingered, a darkness older than the town itself. The town of Ashgrove was small and isolated, nestled within the dense woods, its streets often blanketed in mist that clung to the cobblestones like a shroud. The people who lived there had grown accustomed to the perpetual gloom, the way the fog seemed to swallow sound, leaving the world muted and gray. It was as if the town itself was trapped in a timeless void, where the present bled into the past, and the future seemed as unreachable as the light beyond the trees. Lila was born into this world of shadows and silence, a child of the forest as much as of the town. She was a quiet girl, with wide, curious eyes that seemed to take in everything around her. Her parents loved her dearly, though they often worried about her peculiar nature. Lila was different from other children. She was introspective, more attuned to the whispering trees and the shifting shadows than to the laughter and games of her peers. But there was one thing about Lila that everyone in Ashgrove could agree on: her voice. Lila's voice was a gift, a sweet and haunting melody that could soothe even the most troubled soul. When she sang, the air seemed to still, and the fog lifted just enough to let the light through. Her voice was the only thing in Ashgrove that could cut through the ever-present silence. But one morning, everything changed. Lila awoke in her small bedroom, the pale light of dawn filtering through the thin curtains. She stretched, yawning, and tried to call out to her mother, who was likely downstairs preparing breakfast. But no sound came. Startled, Lila tried again, her lips moving, her throat straining, but still there was nothing. Panic set in, and she stumbled out of bed, rushing to the mirror on her wall. Her reflection stared back at her, wide-eyed and terrified. Her mouth moved silently, forming the words she wanted to scream. But the room remained deathly quiet. Her parents found her there, tears streaming down her face, her hands clutching her throat. They tried to calm her, but there was nothing they could do to bring back her voice. The town's doctor, an old man with a face like weathered stone, examined her thoroughly. He checked her throat, her lungs, her vocal cords, but found nothing amiss. There was no physical reason for her sudden muteness. He looked at her parents with a mixture of pity and confusion, offering them no answers, only the cold comfort of uncertainty. Days turned into weeks, and Lila remained silent. The town, which had once been filled with the sound of her singing, grew even quieter, as if in mourning for her lost voice. The other children, who had once flocked to her side to hear her sing, now avoided her, their eyes filled with fear. The adults whispered among themselves, their voices hushed and urgent. They spoke of curses, of ancient spirits that haunted the forest, of things best left undisturbed. The townsfolk had always been superstitious, but now their fears were focused on Lila. They believed that something dark had taken her voice, something from the forest that had slipped into their world and stolen it away. Lila could hear their whispers, even though they tried to keep them from her. She could hear everything: the creak of the floorboards, the rustle of leaves outside her window, the murmur of voices through the walls. Her hearing, once so normal, had become almost supernaturally acute. Every sound was magnified, every whisper a roar. It was as if her other senses were compensating for her lost voice, but it was too much. The world around her was a cacophony of noise, overwhelming her, driving her to the brink of madness. Her parents, desperate to help her, sought out the seer, an old woman who lived on the outskirts of the town, near the edge of the forest. The seer was a figure of fear and reverence in Ashgrove, known for her knowledge of the old ways, the forgotten rituals, and the spirits that were said to dwell in the woods. She was a relic of a bygone era, her face lined with age, her eyes sharp and knowing. When Lila's parents brought her to the seer's cottage, they were filled with a mixture of hope and dread. The seer examined Lila with a keen eye, taking in her pale face, her trembling hands, her wide, fearful eyes. She didn't speak, didn't ask questions. Instead, she took Lila's hands in her own, her grip surprisingly strong, and closed her eyes. For a long time, there was only silence, the kind of heavy, oppressive silence that seemed to weigh down the air. Finally, the seer released Lila's hands and opened her eyes. She looked at Lila's parents, her expression grave. The seer told them that Lila's voice had been taken by something ancient, something that lived in the heart of the forest. It was known as the Echo, a spirit that fed on sound, consuming the voices of those who wandered too close to its domain. The Echo was a creature of darkness, born of the forest's deepest shadows, a being that had existed long before the town of Ashgrove was built. It was a predator, a hunter that lured its prey with familiar sounds, drawing them deeper into the woods until they were lost forever. The seer warned Lila's parents that the echo would not be easily appeased. It had taken Lila's voice because it craved the purity and beauty of her sound, and it would not return it willingly. But there was a way to reclaim what had been lost. Lila's parents would have to venture into the forest, to the place where the trees stood tallest and the shadows were deepest, and confront the echo. There, in the heart of the darkness, they would find a way to retrieve Lila's voice. But the journey would be perilous, and the cost could be great. Lila's parents were terrified, but they knew they had no choice. They could not bear to see their daughter suffer any longer. They prepared for the journey as best they could, gathering supplies and weapons, though they knew that physical tools would be of little use against the supernatural forces that awaited them. The townsfolk watched in silence as they set out, their faces pale and drawn. They knew that the forest was a place of danger, a place where people sometimes disappeared without a trace. But Lila's parents had no choice. They had to try. The forest was thick and impenetrable, the trees towering above them like ancient sentinels. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, and the ground was soft and spongy beneath their feet. The deeper they went, the darker it became, the light fading until it was almost impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. The silence was absolute, broken only by the occasional snap of a twig or the rustle of unseen creatures in the undergrowth. It was as if the forest itself was alive, watching them, waiting for them to make a mistake. As they ventured deeper into the woods, Lila's parents began to feel a growing sense of dread. The trees seemed to close in around them, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The path they had been following gradually disappeared, swallowed up by the undergrowth, leaving them disoriented and lost. The forest was a labyrinth, a maze of shadows and darkness that twisted and turned, leading them in circles, deeper into the heart of the woods. And then they heard it, the sound they had been dreading. It was Lila's voice, soft and sweet, calling out to them from the darkness. It was exactly as they remembered, but there was something wrong, something unnatural about the way it echoed through the trees. It was too perfect, too pure, as if it had been stripped of all emotion, all humanity. The sound sent chills down their spines, filling them with a sense of dread that was almost overwhelming. They knew it was the echo trying to lure them deeper into the forest, but the sound of their daughter's voice was too much to resist. They followed the sound, pushing through the thick undergrowth, their hearts pounding in their chests. The forest seemed to grow darker with each step, the shadows deepening until it was almost impossible to see. The air grew colder, and the smell of decay became stronger, as if the forest was rotting from within. Finally, they reached a clearing, a small circular space where the trees stood tallest, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out the sky. The ground was covered in a thick layer of moss, soft and spongy beneath their feet. In the center of the clearing stood a tall, dark figure, its form shifting and flickering like a shadow in the moonlight. It was the echo, the creature that had stolen their daughter's voice. The echo was a thing of darkness, a being that seemed to be made of the very shadows that surrounded it. Its form was constantly shifting, changing, as if it was not bound by the same physical laws as the living. It had no face, no features, just a dark, indistinct shape that seemed to absorb all the light around it. The air around it vibrated with a low humming sound, a sound that resonated deep within the earth, shaking the ground beneath their feet. The echo moved closer, its form shifting and twisting as it drew near. Lila's parents could feel the cold emanating from it, a chill that seemed to seep into their bones. They could hear their daughter's voice, clearer now, more insistent, calling out to them, pleading with them to save her. But they knew it was a trap, a deception meant to lure them closer, to draw them into the echo's grasp. The echo reached out with long, slender fingers, its touch as cold as death. Lila's parents recoiled, trying to back away, but the creature was faster, its movements fluid and graceful. It wrapped its fingers around Lila's mother's throat, squeezing tightly, cutting off her air. She struggled, but the echo's grip was unyielding, its strength far beyond that of any human. Lila's father watched in horror as his wife's face turned pale, her eyes wide with fear. He tried to intervene, to pull the echo away, but his hands passed through the creature as if it were made of smoke. The echo tightened its grip, and with a final violent twist, it snapped Lila's mother's neck, the sound of breaking bones echoing through the clearing. Lila's father screamed, a sound of pure primal anguish that tore through the silence. He fell to his knees, his hands shaking, his mind reeling with the horror of what he had just witnessed. The echo stood over him, its form shifting and flickering as if mocking him, taunting him with its presence. But even in his grief, Lila's father knew he couldn't give up. He had to save his daughter, even if it cost him his life. With trembling hands, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the silver bell that the seer had given him. The bell was small and unassuming, but it was said to have the power to banish spirits, to drive them back into the darkness from whence they came. With a final, desperate act of defiance, Lila's father rang the bell. The sound was sharp and clear, cutting through the oppressive silence like a knife. The echo recoiled, its form distorting and twisting as if in pain. It let out a low, guttural sound, a sound that resonated deep within the earth, shaking the ground beneath their feet. The echo began to retreat, its form dissolving into the shadows as the sound of the bell continued to ring out. Lila's father rang the bell again and again, each chime driving the echo further back, until finally it was gone, swallowed up by the darkness of the forest. But the victory was hollow. Lila's father fell to the ground, his strength gone, his heart broken. He had lost his wife, and though he had driven the echo away, he knew that it would return. The forest was its domain, its home, and it would not be banished for long. Lila's father crawled to his wife's lifeless body, cradling her in his arms. He wept for her, for the life they had shared, for the future they had lost. But most of all, he wept for Lila, for the daughter he had failed to protect. As he lay there, broken and defeated, he heard a sound, a faint, distant sound that seemed to come from the very heart of the forest. It was Lila's voice, soft and sweet, singing a song that he had taught her when she was just a child. The sound filled him with a sense of peace, a sense of finality. He knew that it was the echo, returning to claim what it had lost, but he didn't care. He was too tired, too broken to fight anymore. The darkness closed in around him, and the last thing he heard before the shadows consumed him was the sound of Lila's voice, singing him to sleep.